The echo of a gunshot tore through the midday stillness as Elizabeth Blackwell's stallion reared in terror, his massive hooves pawing at the empty air inches from the canyon's edge. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving landscape of southern Utah offered no mercy to those who misjudged its dangers, a lesson Elizabeth was about to learn in the most brutal fashion. "Easy, Storm," she cried, her fingers desperately clutching at the reins as the animal bucked wildly beneath her. The horse, a magnificent black Arabian she'd paid too much for in Salt Lake City, had proven temperamental from the start. Now, as a rattlesnake slithered away from their path, Storm's fear overwhelmed any training. One violent jolt sent Elizabeth's hat flying. The second tore her from the saddle entirely. For a suspended moment, she was airborne, her amber riding skirt billowing around her legs, her scream lost to the vastness of the Red Canyon. Then gravity claimed her, and she plummeted down the steep, rocky slope, a cascade of loose stones following in her wake. The last thing Elizabeth remembered was the strange beauty of the cloud-speckled sky framed by the canyon walls above her, before darkness swallowed her whole. 3 miles away, Randy Jameson crouched by a stream, refilling his canteens. At 28, Randy had spent half his life as a cowhand, the last 3 years riding for the Circle M Ranch outside Beaver, Utah. He lifted his weathered Stetson to wipe sweat from his brow when he heard the distant sound of a horse's panicked whinny. Standing, he squinted against the harsh sun and spotted a riderless horse galloping wildly along the canyon rim. The Arabian's empty stirrups and torn reins told him everything he needed to know. "Damn it all," he muttered, vaulting onto his faithful buckskin gelding. "Come on, Dusty. Someone's in trouble." Randy rode hard toward the agitated horse, which skittered away nervously as he approached. After several attempts, he finally grabbed its trailing reins. "Whoa now, fella. Where's your rider?" His eyes scanned the ground for signs, finally spotting a woman's hat caught on a sagebrush near the canyon edge. Dismounting cautiously, he approached the rim and peered over. His heart nearly stopped. Halfway down the steep canyon wall, a splash of amber fabric was visible among the rocks and scrub brush. "Hello down there," he called, his voice echoing. "Can you hear me?" Only silence answered. Randy assessed the canyon wall. It wasn't a sheer drop, more of a steep, treacherous slope, punctuated by rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation. Dangerous, but not impossible to navigate. Without hesitation, he secured both horses to a sturdy juniper tree and retrieved a rope from his saddle. Tying one end to his horse's saddle horn, he fashioned a crude harness around his body with the other end and began his descent. The sun beat mercilessly against his back as he carefully picked his way down, dislodging small avalanches of pebbles with each step. Sweat soaked through his chambray shirt, and his leather gloves grew slick as he gripped the rope. After what seemed an eternity, Randy reached the amber fabric, a torn piece of a woman's riding skirt caught on a thorny bush. 20 feet below, he spotted her. She lay crumpled against an outcropping of rock, unconscious but, miraculously, not at the canyon's bottom. A stroke of luck, the complete fall would have certainly killed her. Randy doubled his pace, skidding the last few yards to her side. She was beautiful, despite the circumstances, chestnut hair tumbling from what had been an elegant coiffure, fair skin now marred by scratches and forming bruises. Her riding habit, clearly expensive and fashionable, was torn and dusty. Blood seeped from a gash at her temple, and her right arm lay at an unnatural angle that made Randy wince. "Madam, can you hear me?" He gently pressed 2 fingers to her neck, relieved to find a pulse. "I'm going to get you out of here." Her eyelids fluttered but remained closed. Randy assessed their situation grimly. She needed a doctor, and soon. The climb back up would be nearly impossible while carrying her, but they couldn't stay here with night approaching and the temperature set to plummet. He removed his bandana and dampened it with water from his canteen, carefully wiping blood from her face. The woman moaned softly. "That's it. Come back to me now," Randy encouraged. Her eyes opened a startling green that reminded him of spring pastures, then immediately squeezed shut against the pain. "Don't move," he instructed. "You've had a bad fall. I'm Randy Jameson from the Circle M. Can you tell me your name?" "Elizabeth," she whispered hoarsely. "Elizabeth Blackwell." "Well, Miss Blackwell, you've gotten yourself into quite a predicament. That horse of yours threw you clear over the edge." "Storm," she murmured. "Is he?" "Your horse is fine, just spooked. He's up top with mine." Randy continued his examination, checking for broken ribs and other injuries. "I'm afraid your arm's broken and you might have a concussion. We need to get you to a doctor." Elizabeth attempted to sit up but fell back with a cry of pain. "Please, don't move," Randy said more firmly. "I'm going to carry you out of here, but first I need to splint that arm and wrap your ribs." Using branches and strips torn from his spare shirt, Randy created a crude but effective splint for her arm. Each touch drew winces and stifled gasps from Elizabeth, but she remained surprisingly stoic. "You're handling this better than most cowboys I know," he remarked, trying to distract her as he worked. "Not my first injury," she replied through gritted teeth, "though perhaps my most dramatic. What brings you out here alone? These canyons aren't for solitary rides." A shadow crossed her face. "I wasn't planning to venture so far. I'm staying with my aunt in Beaver While." She trailed off, pain or perhaps something else silencing her. Randy nodded, not pressing further. Everyone had their secrets out west. "Well, Miss Blackwell, I'm going to carry you back up now. It won't be comfortable, but I'll be as gentle as I can." "I trust you," she whispered, those green eyes meeting his with unexpected intensity. Something stirred in Randy's chest, a protective instinct stronger than any he'd felt before. This woman, with her quiet strength and trusting gaze, awakened something in him he'd thought long dormant. "Hold on to me with your good arm," he instructed, carefully positioning himself. With deliberate movements, he lifted her against his chest, cradling her as gently as possible. Elizabeth bit back a cry, burying her face against his shoulder. Randy could feel her tears dampening his shirt, but she made no complaint. The ascent was grueling. Randy placed each foot with extreme care, bearing Elizabeth's weight plus his own. The rope harness helped, but every step jarred them both. Halfway up, he had to stop on a narrow ledge, his muscles burning in protest. "Are you all right?" Elizabeth asked weakly, concerned despite her own condition. Randy chuckled breathlessly. "Shouldn't I be asking you that? We're both in this canyon together," she managed. Something about her words struck him. Yes, they were in this together, strangers thrust into an intimate struggle for survival. Randy felt a surprising connection to this woman, forged in danger and pain. "Just a little farther," he promised, gathering his strength. The final portion of the climb was the steepest. Randy's arms ached, his back screamed in protest, but he pushed onward. Elizabeth had fallen silent, worryingly so, her breathing shallow against his neck. When they finally reached the rim, Randy's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He staggered to a flat area away from the edge and gently laid Elizabeth down in the shade of a juniper tree. "We made it," he said, collapsing beside her to catch his breath, her eyes fluttered open. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said with surprising firmness. "They wouldn't have." Randy busied himself retrieving the canteen from his horse, avoiding the intensity of her gaze. He helped her drink, supporting her head with gentle hands. "Beaver's too far to reach before dark," he said, assessing the sinking sun. "There's a line shack about an hour's ride from here. We can shelter there tonight, and I'll get you to town and the doctor's first thing tomorrow." Elizabeth nodded weakly. "Whatever you think best." Randy fashioned a more comfortable sling for her arm using his spare shirt, then considered how best to transport her. Her horse, though calmer now, was still skittish and unfamiliar to him. "You'll ride with me on Dusty," he decided. "He's steady as they come." Mounting first, Randy then carefully lifted Elizabeth to sit sideways in front of him, her injured arm protected between them. He secured Storm's reins to his saddle horn, and they set off at a gentle pace that wouldn't jar her injuries too badly. Elizabeth leaned against his chest, occasionally drifting in and out of consciousness. Each time she stirred, Randy reassured her with quiet words until she settled again. The weight of her in his arms felt strangely right, as if she belonged there. By the time they reached the line shack, twilight had fallen. The small, crude structure was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, used by cowhands during roundup or when checking fence lines far from the main ranch. Randy had stayed here many times before, but never with a beautiful, injured woman in his care. He helped Elizabeth inside and settled her on the single narrow cot while he lit the oil lamp and stoked a small fire in the potbelly stove. "It's not much," he apologized, looking around at the sparse accommodations. "It's perfect," she replied, her voice stronger now. "Truly, Mr. Jameson, I cannot thank you enough. Without you, I would have died in that canyon." "Randy," he corrected. "And you're welcome, though I wish we'd met under better circumstances." In the lamplight, Randy could better assess her injuries. The gash on her temple had stopped bleeding but needed cleaning. Her arm was securely splinted, but the bruising visible at her collar and wrists concerned him. "I need to check your injuries more thoroughly," he said awkwardly. "But propriety matters little when one is fighting for survival," Elizabeth interrupted. "Please do what you must." Randy nodded, grateful for her practical nature. He dampened a clean cloth and gently cleaned the wound at her temple, then checked her pupils for signs of serious concussion. Finding her responsive and alert, he relaxed slightly. "I think you'll live, Miss Blackwell." "Elizabeth, please, and I certainly hope so." "I've come too far to die in a canyon in Utah." Randy raised an eyebrow. "And where did you come from that made such a journey necessary?" A shadow crossed her face. "Boston, most recently, though it seems a lifetime ago now." Randy didn't press further, instead busying himself preparing a simple meal from his saddlebags, jerky softened in hot water, hardtack, and coffee. "It's not fancy dining," he apologized, helping her sit up to eat. "I've had worse," she replied with a small smile that transformed her face, making Randy's heart skip unexpectedly. As they ate, Elizabeth gradually revealed more about herself. She was 24, educated at a ladies' seminary in the East, and had come west to stay with her father's sister after a situation in Boston had made remaining there impossible. "A situation?" Randy couldn't help asking. Elizabeth sighed. "I broke an engagement. To a man my father's business partner considered very suitable. Unfortunately, I discovered he was only interested in my father's connections and my presumed inheritance." Her face hardened. "When I confronted him, he showed his true character. It became unpleasant." "He hurt you," Randy stated flatly, anger rising at the thought. "He tried," she corrected. "I proved less defenseless than he anticipated, but the scandal—" She shrugged her good shoulder. "My father suggested I visit Aunt Viola until the gossip subsided." Randy's estimation of Elizabeth rose further. Not only beautiful and brave, but fierce when necessary. "And what about you, Randy Jameson? What's your story?" she asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. Randy stared into the small fire. Not much to tell. Orphaned young, raised by my uncle who ran cattle in Wyoming. Started cowboying at 14 and never looked back. Been with Circle M for 3 years now. No wife. Family, he shook his head. A cowhand's life isn't conducive to such things. Always moving, following the work. And yet you seem the type of man who would make an excellent husband and father, Elizabeth observed, her gaze direct in a way that both unsettled and intrigued him. Randy cleared his throat, unaccustomed to such forthright conversation with a lady. It's getting late. You should rest. Tomorrow will be taxing enough. He made himself a pallet on the floor with his bedroll, insisting Elizabeth take the cot despite her protests. I've slept on harder ground in worse conditions, he assured her, extinguishing the lamp. In the darkness, with only the faint glow from the banked stove, Randy listened to Elizabeth's breathing gradually slow as she drifted to sleep. His own thoughts kept him awake far longer, circling around the extraordinary woman fate had quite literally thrown into his path. Dawn broke with golden light filtering through the lined shack's single dirty window. Randy woke instantly, years of early mornings ingrained in his body. Elizabeth still slept, her face peaceful despite the bruises now blooming in vivid colors across her skin. He slipped outside to tend the horses and wash at the nearby stream, giving her privacy. When he returned, she was awake, attempting to tidy her hair one-handed with limited success. "Good morning," he greeted, setting down a freshly filled canteen. "How are you feeling?" "Like I fell into a canyon," she replied wryly, wincing as she shifted position. "But alive, thanks to you. We should reach town by midday if we leave soon. Dr. Winters is a good man, treated many a cowboy after stampedes and such." Elizabeth nodded, then looked down at her torn and dirty riding habit with dismay. "I must look a frightful mess." "You look like a survivor," Randy countered sincerely. Something passed between them, then a current of understanding and attraction that neither acknowledged aloud. The ride to Beaver was slow and careful. Elizabeth rode double with Randy again, her body molded against his chest by necessity. Despite her injuries, Randy found himself acutely aware of her feminine presence, the subtle floral scent of her hair, the curve of her waist beneath his steadying arm. Beaver appeared on the horizon around 11, a proper town with several streets, frame buildings, and even a church steeple rising above the rest. As they rode down the main street, heads turned at the sight of a battered woman being carried on a cowboy's horse. "Where does your aunt live?" Randy asked. "The White House at the end of Maple Street. But perhaps the doctor first." Randy nodded and turned toward Dr. Winters' office, a neat building with physician and surgeon painted on the glass door. He helped Elizabeth dismount, supporting her weight as they entered. Dr. Winters, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and efficient hands, took charge immediately. "What happened here?" Horse threw her into Cottonwood Canyon. "Broken arm for certain, possible concussion, bruised ribs." "And you are?" The doctor's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Randy Jameson, sir. I work for Circle M. Found her in the canyon and brought her up." Elizabeth spoke up, her voice stronger than Randy expected. "He saved my life, doctor. I would have died there if not for Mr. Jameson." Dr. Winters nodded, professional demeanor softening. "Let's get you examined, young lady." "Mr. Jameson, you can wait outside." Randy stepped onto the boardwalk, suddenly at loose ends. His responsibility was technically fulfilled. Elizabeth was safe, receiving medical care, and would soon be with family. Their paths had crossed by chance, and now would likely diverge just as randomly. The thought brought an unexpected hollowness to his chest. An hour later, the doctor's door opened. Elizabeth emerged with her arm properly splinted and bandaged, her face cleaned of dirt and blood. She wore a borrowed dress that hung loosely on her frame but was vastly improved from her torn riding habit. "Randy," she said, relief evident in her voice, "you're still here." "Of course. Where else would he be?" Dr. Winters followed her out. "She's fortunate. Clean break of the radius, no severe concussion. Remarkable, considering the fall. She'll need rest, limited movement, and regular checkups, but should heal well." "Thank you, doctor. I've sent word to Mrs. Peterson about her niece's arrival. She's preparing a room and will be expecting you both shortly." "Both?" Randy hesitated, unsure of his place in this next chapter. Elizabeth sensed his uncertainty and reached for his hand with her uninjured one. "Please, I want Aunt Viola to meet the man who saved my life." How could he refuse? Viola Peterson proved to be a robust, no-nonsense widow in her 60s with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. She embraced her niece carefully, then subjected Randy to an assessment so thorough he felt like a horse at auction. "So you're the cowboy who carried my Elizabeth out of certain death," she finally said, apparently satisfied by what she saw. "You'll stay for dinner, of course." It wasn't a question. Dinner stretched into evening, with Viola drawing out Randy's life story with skilled questioning while simultaneously fussing over Elizabeth's comfort. As twilight deepened, Randy reluctantly rose to leave. "I should get back to the ranch. They'll be wondering where I disappeared to." "Nonsense," Viola declared. "It's far too late. We have a perfectly good guest room and I insist you use it. You can return to your ranch in the morning." Randy looked to Elizabeth, who smiled encouragingly. "Please stay. I'd rest easier knowing you weren't riding those dark trails tonight." And so began a pattern that would shape the coming weeks. Randy returned to the Circle M the next morning, explaining the situation to his foreman, who granted him 2 days off, partly in recognition of the rescue, partly because work was slow in this season. Randy spent those days in Beaver, ostensibly checking on Elizabeth's recovery, but increasingly drawn by her company. They talked for hours on Viola's front porch, Randy sharing stories of cattle drives and frontier adventures, Elizabeth describing Boston society and her education. Despite their different backgrounds, they discovered shared values, compatible humor, and a mutual love of literature that surprised them both. When Randy reluctantly returned to regular duties, he found reasons to ride into Beaver whenever possible. Elizabeth's aunt watched their growing attachment with knowing eyes, but offered no interference beyond ensuring proper chaperoning. 3 weeks after the accident, Randy arrived at the Peterson home to find Elizabeth sitting on the porch swing, her splinted arm resting in her lap. Her face brightened at the sight of him, sending a surge of warmth through his chest. "The doctor says I'm healing nicely," she greeted him. "Perhaps we could take a short walk today. I'm tired of these 4 walls." They strolled slowly down Beaver's quiet streets, Elizabeth's good arm looped through Randy's. People nodded greetings, some smiling knowingly at the pair. In the small town, their story had become something of a romantic legend. "I received a letter from my father yesterday," Elizabeth said as they reached the small town park. "He asks when I'm returning to Boston." Randy's heart sank. Of course her life was in the East, not this frontier town. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing yet." She guided them to a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. "Randy, these past weeks have been unexpected." "That's one word for it," he agreed, trying to keep his tone light despite the heaviness in his chest. "When I came west, I was running from something. From disappointment, from scandal, from a life that suddenly seemed hollow." She turned to face him directly. "I never expected to find something to run toward instead." Randy swallowed hard. "Elizabeth, please, let me finish. I know we've known each other only briefly and under unusual circumstances, but I've never felt so understood, so seen by anyone before you." Hope bloomed in Randy's chest, dangerous and fragile. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm not ready to return to Boston. I'm saying that when I imagine my future now, you're in it." Her cheeks flushed beautifully. "I'm saying that I believe I'm falling in love with you, Randy Jameson, and it terrifies and thrills me in equal measure." Randy took her hand gently. "From the moment I carried you up that canyon wall, something changed in me, as if I'd been waiting my whole life to find the person worth climbing down for." Elizabeth's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Is this madness, to feel this way so quickly?" "If it's madness, then I'm happily insane," Randy replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Elizabeth Blackwell, I love you. I should wait to say it, be more cautious, but life out here teaches you that tomorrow isn't guaranteed." "Then we shouldn't waste today," she whispered, leaning closer. Their first kiss was gentle, mindful of her healing injuries but charged with emotion that had been building since that fateful day in the canyon. When they parted, both were breathless. "Your father will think you've lost your mind," Randy murmured, "falling for a penniless cowboy." Elizabeth smiled. "My father entrusted me to Aunt Viola because she's the strongest woman he knows. If she approves of you, he'll come around." "And does she approve?" she said, and I quote, "That young man looks at you like you're water in the desert." "Don't throw that away for stuffy Boston society." Randy laughed. "I like your aunt more every day." The following weeks brought both joy and challenges. Randy spoke to his foreman at the Circle M, who offered him a promotion to assistant foreman, a position that would mean more stability, better pay, and a small cabin on the ranch property. "It's not much compared to what you're used to," Randy told Elizabeth as they rode out to see the cabin. Her arm was healing well, and she'd insisted on accompanying him, riding a gentle mare Viola had purchased to replace the still skittish Storm. The cabin was indeed modest, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, plank floors worn smooth by previous occupants. But it sat on a slight rise with views of mountains to the east and pasture ellen to the west. "It's perfect," Elizabeth declared, turning slowly to take it all in. "Just needs some curtains, perhaps a garden next spring." Randy watched her, amazed anew at this woman who had exchanged silk gowns for practical calico without complaint, who had embraced Western life with enthusiasm rather than resignation. "You truly be happy here, as a rancher's wife?" he asked, still sometimes disbelieving his good fortune. Elizabeth crossed to him, taking both his hands in hers. "I'd be happy anywhere with you, but yes, especially here. I feel alive in a way I never did in Boston." Randy pulled her close, inhaling the lavender scent of her hair. "I never thought I'd find someone like you." "Especially not at the bottom of a canyon," Elizabeth laughed. "Perhaps we should thank my temperamental horse." "Perhaps we should sell him before he tries to kill you again," Randy countered wryly. Elizabeth's father's response to her letter explaining her decision to remain in Utah came several weeks later. The thick envelope contained not recriminations, as they'd feared, but tentative acceptance, questions about their plans, and most surprisingly, a generous wedding gift in the form of a bank draft. "He says he trusts my judgment," Elizabeth said wonderingly, reading the letter aloud to Randy and Viola over supper. "And that he hopes to meet the man brave enough to climb down a canyon for his daughter." "Your father sounds like a reasonable man," Randy observed, relieved. "He is, when given time to consider matters, and Mother has likely influenced him. She always wanted my happiness above all else." The wedding took place that November in Beaver's small church. Elizabeth wore a cream-colored gown Viola helped her make, with lace sent by her mother from Boston. Randy, unusually clean-shaven and uncomfortable in his new suit, waited at the altar with a mixture of nervousness and profound joy. When Elizabeth appeared at the church doors, her face radiant beneath a simple veil, Randy felt his heart might burst. This extraordinary woman had chosen him, had embraced his world so completely. As she walked toward him, he silently renewed the promise he'd made that day in the canyon to always protect her, to never let her fall again. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with such genuine emotion that several attendees discreetly dabbed at eyes. Viola watched with unabashed tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as the two people she'd come to love pledged their lives to one another. The celebration afterward united the disparate elements of their lives: cowboys from the Circle M, townspeople from Beaver who had adopted Elizabeth as one of their own, and even two representatives from Boston. Elizabeth's younger brother Edward and her childhood friend Margaret, who had braved the transcontinental railroad journey to witness the event. "I came expecting to rescue you from a fate worse than death," Edward confessed to his sister at the reception. "Instead, I find you happier than I've ever seen you." Elizabeth smiled, watching Randy across the room where he was engrossed in conversation with her friend Margaret. Sometimes rescue comes in unexpected forms. Their wedding night was spent in the newly renovated cabin on Circle M land. Randy had worked evenings and weekends to make improvements: a new roof, repaired floorboards, fresh paint. Elizabeth had added feminine touches: curtains, quilts, pressed flowers framed on the walls. As Randy carried his bride across the threshold, an echo of that first, desperate carrying from the canyon, Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "I believe this is becoming a habit, Mr. Jameson. Only the best kind of habit, Mrs. Jameson," he replied, setting her gently on her feet and claiming her lips in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Spring came to southern Utah, transforming the landscape. The cabin Randy and Elizabeth now called home stood surrounded by a riot of wildflowers Elizabeth had planted in the fall. A vegetable garden took shape behind the house, and a small corral held their horses, including a gentle mare Randy had given Elizabeth as a wedding present. Life settled into a rhythm different from what either had expected for themselves, but perfectly suited to who they'd become together. Randy's position as assistant foreman kept him busy, but allowed him to return home most evenings. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had become an integral part of ranch life, helping with accounts, nursing sick calves, and even learning to ride alongside the hands during less demanding cattle work. Her Boston family, initially skeptical, had come to recognize the authenticity of her happiness. Her parents had even promised a visit in the coming summer, a prospect Elizabeth anticipated with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. One evening in late April, Randy returned home to find Elizabeth sitting on their porch, an expression of serene joy illuminating her features. "What has you looking so pleased with yourself?" he asked, dropping a kiss on her upturned face. "I have news," she replied, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Randy stared, momentarily speechless, then gathered her in his arms with a whoop of joy that startled their horses. "A baby," he repeated in wonder, cradling her face. "Are you certain?" Dr. Winters confirmed it today. "He says around November, appropriately enough." "Our wedding anniversary," Randy marveled. "Elizabeth, you've made me the happiest man in the territory." Later that night, as they lay entwined in their bed, Randy's hand protectively covering the place where their child grew, Elizabeth mused, "It's strange to think how a single moment can change everything. If Storm hadn't thrown me that day." "I like to think we would have found each other anyway," Randy said. "Some things are just meant to be." Elizabeth smiled in the darkness. The cowboy and the Boston girl, Who would have thought? I thank God every day for that temperamental horse, Randy whispered, pulling her closer. And for the canyon that brought you to me. The months passed in a blur of preparation. Randy added a small room to their cabin, building furniture with his own hands for the coming child. Elizabeth sewed tiny garments and read everything she could find about childbirth and infant care. The entire Circle M adopted their anticipation, with weathered cowboys awkwardly presenting handmade toys and gruff advice about parenthood. Elizabeth's parents arrived in July. Her father, Nathaniel Blackwell, a dignified businessman, whose skepticism melted upon seeing his daughter's obvious happiness and prosperity. Her mother, Caroline, elegant even in traveling clothes, embraced ranch life with surprising enthusiasm, often joining Elizabeth in the garden or kitchen. "He's a good man, your cowboy," Nathaniel told Elizabeth one evening as they watched Randy and Caroline inspect the new calf pen. "I came prepared to find fault, but I cannot. Thank you, Father. That means more than you know. Your mother and I have discussed it," he continued, somewhat formally. "We'd like to establish a trust for the child and for any future grandchildren. Nothing ostentatious, but enough to ensure educational opportunities and a good start in life." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Randy might be too proud to accept. "Then we shall frame it as a grandparent's prerogative rather than charity," Nathaniel said firmly. "Your husband has given you happiness beyond price. Allow us this small contribution to your family's future." The Blackwells departed in August with promises to return when the baby arrived. Elizabeth, now visibly pregnant, stood waving until their carriage disappeared from view. "They're good people," Randy acknowledged as they walked back to their cabin. "I judged them unfairly before meeting them." "They surprised me too," Elizabeth admitted. "I never expected Father to ride out with you to check fence lines or Mother to learn to make sourdough bread." "Our child will have the best of both worlds," Randy said, his hand gently cradling her growing belly. "Eastern education and Western spirit." As her pregnancy advanced, Elizabeth's thoughts often returned to the canyon where their story began. One crisp October day, she asked Randy to take her there. "Are you sure?" he asked, concerned. "It's not an easy journey, especially in your condition." "I'm sure," she insisted. "I need to see it again before the baby comes." Randy relented but insisted they take the wagon rather than ride. The journey was slow and careful, Randy constantly checking that the rough trail wasn't jarring Elizabeth too much. When they reached the canyon rim, Randy helped Elizabeth from the wagon and supported her as they walked to the edge, staying well back from the drop that had nearly claimed her life. The canyon stretched before them, its red walls glowing in the autumn sunlight. Elizabeth gazed down at the slope where she had fallen, then at the arduous path Randy had taken to reach her. "It looks even more impossible now," she said softly. "That you found me, that you carried me up. It's a miracle we're standing here." Randy's arm tightened around her. "The first of many miracles." As if in agreement, their baby kicked vigorously, causing Elizabeth to laugh and place Randy's hand where he could feel the movement. "Already trying to join the conversation," Randy said, awe in his voice. They stood there together, three souls connected by love and providence, gazing out at the landscape that had brought them together. 3 weeks later, after 14 hours of labor that left Randy pacing anxiously outside their bedroom, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy son they named Nathaniel Jameson, Daniel, for Randy's father, Nathaniel for Elizabeth's. "He has your eyes," Elizabeth whispered exhaustedly as Randy held their son for the first time, wonder and terror mingling on his face. "And your determination," Randy replied, noting the strong grip of the tiny fingers around his own. "Poor Dr. Winters looked more worn out than you." Elizabeth smiled tiredly. I may have been somewhat vocal during the final stages. The whole ranch heard you, my love, Randy said with a grin. Old Pete said it reminded him of a mountain lion he once encountered. Elizabeth laughed, then winced. Don't make me laugh, everything hurts. Randy placed their son in the cradle beside the bed, then stretched out carefully next to his wife, drawing her against his chest. You were magnificent, brave as any cowboy I've ever known. Higher praise I cannot imagine, she teased, already drifting toward much-needed sleep. I love you, Elizabeth Jameson, Randy whispered against her hair. You and Daniel are everything I never knew to wish for. The years flowed like the seasons, each bringing new challenges and joys. Daniel grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick intelligence. When he was 2, a sister joined the family, Violet Caroline, named for Elizabeth's aunt and mother. The Circle M prospered under new ownership when the original rancher retired, with Randy promoted to foreman and given an ownership stake in recognition of his contributions. Elizabeth, meanwhile, established a small but successful side business breeding and training horses, her understanding of the animals deepening with experience. Her parents visited regularly, gradually extending their stays until they finally purchased a winter home in Beaver, dividing their year between Boston society and their growing Western family. Viola, now in her 70s but still formidable, remained a beloved fixture in their lives, teaching Daniel and Violet everything from checkers to rifle shooting, despite Elizabeth's occasional protests about the latter. One evening, as they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner after the children were asleep, Randy presented Elizabeth with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a delicate silver pendant. "Look closely," Randy urged. Elizabeth held it to the lamplight and gasped softly. The silver had been worked into a miniature representation of the canyon where they met, with tiny figures, a woman fallen, a man climbing down to reach her. "Randy, it's beautiful," she whispered, tears welling. "Where did you get this?" "Remember Thomas Whitefeather, who does silver work in town? I described what I wanted and he created it." Randy took the necklace and fastened it around her neck. "To remind us where our journey began." Elizabeth touched the pendant, emotion making speech difficult. "As if I could ever forget." 10 years, Randy marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday I found you in that canyon. Other times I can't remember life before you." "The best 10 years," Elizabeth agreed, rising to sit in his lap, a familiarity that had never lost its sweetness, though not without challenges. They had weathered their share of difficulties, drought years that threatened the ranch, a severe illness that had nearly taken Daniel as a toddler, the painful loss of an expected 3rd child. Through it all, their partnership had only deepened, each trial reinforcing what they'd learned in that first desperate rescue, that together they could survive anything. "You ever regret it?" Randy asked suddenly. "Staying here, choosing this life over Boston?" Elizabeth framed his face with her hands, looking directly into the eyes she knew better than her own. "Not for a single moment. This is exactly where I belong." Their kiss was interrupted by a small voice from the doorway. "Papa, I had a bad dream." 4-year-old Violet stood clutching her favorite blanket, dark curls tousled from sleep. Randy beckoned her over. "Come here, little flower." Violet climbed into their laps, a warm weight between them. "Tell me the canyon story," she requested, her standard comfort when upset. Elizabeth exchanged an amused glance with Randy. The canyon story had become legend not just in their household but throughout the community, embellished over the years into an epic tale of danger and romance. "Once upon a time," Randy began, his deep voice dropping to the storytelling cadence their children loved. There was a beautiful but stubborn lady from Boston who thought she could ride a wild horse near a dangerous canyon. Elizabeth rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the familiar tale and marveling at how one moment of danger had led to this rich, full life she could never have imagined for herself. Later, after Violet had fallen asleep between them and been returned to her own bed, Elizabeth and Randy stood on their porch beneath a sky ablaze with stars. The ranch spread peacefully around them, their little corner of the vast western landscape they both now called home. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Jameson," Randy murmured, pulling her against his chest. "Happy anniversary, my rescuer," she replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. Above them, a shooting star blazed across the heavens, a reminder, Elizabeth thought, of how swiftly life could change, how a single moment could alter one's course forever. Her hand found the canyon pendant at her throat, a tangible reminder of the fall that had, paradoxically, lifted her to heights of happiness she'd never known possible. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the land they'd both come to love. Elizabeth smiled against Randy's shoulder, thankful for temperamental horses, dangerous canyons, and brave cowboys who didn't hesitate to climb down after fallen women. Some rescues, she reflected, lasted a lifetime. And some falls led not to destruction, but to the greatest adventure of all. The years continued their steady march. Daniel, at 18, departed for college in Denver, a compromise between Randy's desire for his son to learn ranching firsthand and Elizabeth's insistence on formal education. Violet, now 15, showed every indication of following in her mother's path, with a particular talent for horsemanship, and a determination that sometimes left both parents exasperated and proud. The Circle M had grown under Randy's leadership, absorbing smaller neighboring ranches until it became one of the largest operations in southern Utah. Elizabeth's horse breeding business had gained reputation throughout the West, with buyers coming from as far as California for her carefully raised stock. They had built a larger house to replace their original cabin, though the cabin itself remained standing, maintained as a guest house, but mostly preserved as a reminder of their beginnings. Their prosperity, while modest compared to Elizabeth's Boston connections, provided comfort and security neither had taken for granted. On the 25th anniversary of Elizabeth's fall into the canyon, they rode out alone together, a rare day without responsibilities, children, or ranch hands requiring attention. "We're getting old," Randy observed as they dismounted near the canyon rim, his joints protesting more than they once had. At 53, his hair had silvered at the temples, lines etching deeper around his eyes, but he remained strong and straight-backed. "Speak for yourself," Elizabeth retorted, though at 49 she too felt the years in stiffened muscles and the occasional stubborn ache. "I'm in my prime." Randy laughed, the sound as warming to her heart as it had been decades ago. "That you are, my love." They spread a blanket well back from the edge, neither of them tempting fate after all these years, and unpacked the lunch Elizabeth had prepared. Sitting side by side, they gazed out at the view that had changed their lives. "Do you realize," Elizabeth mused, "that I've now lived more of my life here in Utah than I ever did in Boston?" "Does that make you a proper Westerner at last?" Randy teased. "I should hope so." After bearing Western children, running a Western business, and being married to the most Western man imaginable. Randy took her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with hers in a familiar gesture that still brought comfort after all these years. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" "The best," Elizabeth agreed softly. though not the one I imagined as a girl." "What did you imagine?" Elizabeth considered. "Boston society, I suppose. A grand house, servants, social obligations. A respectable husband who would largely ignore me except when presenting me at important functions." Randy grimaced. "Sounds awful." "It does now," Elizabeth agreed. "But it was what I knew, until a certain cowboy showed me a different possibility." They sat in companionable silence, watching an eagle soar over the canyon. 25 years of marriage had given them the gift of comfortable quiet, of understanding that not every moment needed words. Finally, Randy spoke again. "I've been thinking about the future." "Oh." Elizabeth turned to study his face, noting the serious set of his mouth. "Daniel writes that he's considering staying in Denver after graduation. Law school, perhaps." Elizabeth nodded. They discussed their son's letters. "He has a good mind for it. And there's that young lady he mentions with suspicious frequency." Randy smiled briefly before continuing. "And Violet, well, she's made it clear she wants to take over your horse business eventually." "Indeed she has. Quite forcefully, in fact. So I've been thinking." Randy paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've been foreman at Circle M for almost 20 years now. The new owners are good people, but they've mentioned possibly selling in the next few years." Elizabeth waited, sensing his direction but allowing him to find the words. "What would you think about us purchasing the ranch ourselves?" "Not all of it, that would be beyond our means, but the original property, including this canyon. We could build a new house overlooking this view, turn operations over to younger hands as we age, but keep the land in the family." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "You've given this serious thought." "I have. Your father's trust for the children, plus what we've saved over the years. It's possible. Difficult, but possible." Elizabeth gazed out at the canyon, imagining a home perched above this vista that had both nearly taken her life and given her everything she valued. "Our canyon," she said softly. "Legally ours." "Too sentimental?" Randy asked, a rare uncertainty in his voice. Elizabeth turned to him, taking both his hands in hers. "Perfectly sentimental. Yes, Randy, let's do it." The relief and joy in his eyes told her how much this meant to him to secure their future, to own the land that had shaped their story. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I had this made for our anniversary." He pressed a small object into her palm, a gold band inset with a small ruby and diamond. "Randy, it's beautiful," she breathed. "But you already gave me an anniversary gift. This is different. It's an eternity band. 25 years seemed the right time." He took the ring and slid it onto her finger alongside her original wedding band. "For the next 25 years, and however many more were granted." Elizabeth blinked back tears. "How is it possible to love someone more after 25 years than at the beginning?" "I ask myself the same question every morning when I wake up beside you," Randy replied, drawing her close. Their kiss was tender, infused with decades of shared history, joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, the raising of children and the building of a life neither had envisioned but both now couldn't imagine living without. When they finally broke apart, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his. "We should head back. Violet will be returning from her friend's house soon." "Just a few more minutes," Randy said, gathering her against his side as they looked out over the canyon once more. "I want to remember this moment." Elizabeth understood. At their age, with their children grown or growing, these moments of quiet connection became increasingly precious. Time seemed to accelerate with each passing year, the future simultaneously expanding with possibilities and contracting with the awareness of mortality. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met that day?" she asked quietly. Randy considered the question. "I try not to, the thought of a life without you and the children." He shook his head. It doesn't bear contemplating. I would have returned to Boston eventually, Elizabeth mused. Married someone suitable but unexciting. Never known what it meant to truly build something with my own hands, to love someone with my whole heart. And I would have continued drifting from ranch to ranch, Randy added. Growing older alone, never putting down roots. His arm tightened around her. Thank God for temperamental horses. Elizabeth laughed softly. And brave cowboys. They gathered their things and mounted their horses for the ride home, not the impetuous young people who had once met in desperate circumstances, but a mature couple shaped by years of partnership. The canyon behind them stood as a monument to their beginning, while ahead lay the future they continued to build together. 3 years later, Randy and Elizabeth Jameson became the proud owners of the original Circle M property, including the canyon that had brought them together. They built a comfortable home overlooking the vista, with a wide porch perfect for watching sunsets and a separate cabin nearby for their daughter Violet, who had indeed taken over Elizabeth's horse breeding business with remarkable success. Daniel completed law school in Denver and, to everyone's surprise, returned to Beaver to establish a practice. He brought with him his new wife, Rebecca, a doctor's daughter with a gentle manner and sharp intellect that quickly endeared her to his parents. Within 2 years, Randy and Elizabeth welcomed their first grandchild, a granddaughter named Clara Elizabeth, who inherited her grandmother's green eyes and determined nature. As they entered their 60s, Randy and Elizabeth settled into the rhythms of their later years, with the same partnership that had characterized their entire marriage. Randy gradually handed ranch operations to younger men while retaining oversight, spending more time on projects that had been deferred during busier years. Elizabeth wrote down the stories of their life together, preserving them for future generations. One spring morning, as they sat drinking coffee on their porch, watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls with gold and crimson, Elizabeth reached for Randy's hand. "You know what day it is?" she asked softly. Randy smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. 35 years since a stubborn Boston girl fell into my life. And 35 years since a brave cowboy climbed down to find me, she completed. They sat in silence, memories flowing between them without need for words. So much had happened in those 35 years: joy and heartache, success and failure, the 1,000 daily moments that constructed a life together. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth said after a while, "about legacy." Randy raised an eyebrow inquiringly. "This canyon," she continued, gesturing toward the view. "It's part of our story, but it could be more. What if we preserved it, set it aside so it remains untouched?" "For future generations?" Randy asked. Elizabeth nodded. "For our grandchildren and their grandchildren. A place where they can come to remember how their family began." Randy considered the idea, watching an eagle soar over the canyon much as one had done on their 25th anniversary. "Jameson Canyon," he said thoughtfully, "has a nice ring to it." "It does," Elizabeth agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "A place where people can be reminded that sometimes falling leads to the most unexpected blessings." Randy turned to kiss her temple, his lips brushing the silver strands now liberally mixed with her chestnut hair. "And that the hardest climbs bring the greatest rewards." As the sun climbed higher, bathing them in its warmth, Elizabeth closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for a frightened horse, a dangerous fall, and most of all, for the cowboy who had climbed down to rescue her and in doing so, had given her the greatest love story she could have imagined. In the years that followed, Jameson Canyon became a landmark known throughout the region not for its particular beauty, though it was indeed striking, but for the story attached to it. Visitors would stand at the overlook Randy and Elizabeth had built and read the simple plaque that told of a fall, a rescue, and a love that had flourished for decades thereafter. Eventually, as all must, Randy and Elizabeth grew frail. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them with care, the family home becoming a gathering place for multiple generations. Violet's daughter showed promise with horses, while Daniel's son expressed interest in ranching, the legacy continuing in ways both expected and surprising. In their final years together, Randy and Elizabeth would often sit on their porch overlooking the canyon, hands clasped, reminiscing about their extraordinary journey from strangers to soulmates. The fall that might have ended Elizabeth's life had instead given her everything she cherished: a love deeper than she'd known possible, children who brought pride and joy, and a life of purpose and meaning in a place she had come to love more than her birthplace. And Randy, the cowboy who had once thought himself destined for a solitary existence, found in Elizabeth the heart of a family that would continue long after they were gone, their story preserved in the canyon that bore their name, and in the memories of those who had been touched by their remarkable love. For in the end, it wasn't the dramatic rescue that defined them, but all that came after: the daily acts of love and courage, the building of a life together one day at a time, the legacy of love they created that would echo through generations to come. Just as Elizabeth had fallen into the canyon and into Randy's life, they had both fallen into a love that sustained them through 35 years of marriage and beyond, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single misstep, and the bravest journeys start with the decision to climb down after someone who needs rescuing. And in that rescue, finding yourself saved as well.